Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
I'm your minister, the Reverend William Levwood. My pronouns are he and him. I'm so grateful to be with you this morning. As we begin our service, I invite you to silence your phone, to take a deep breath, and to center yourself for worship. We open and welcome to the ancestral people of this land, acknowledging that our church, like all of Burke, rests on the unceded territory of the Manahoac tribe of the Great Sioux Nation. We seek healing and the realization of justice with the people of this land, who live on in their descendants, the present-day members of the Monacan Indian Nation, the Potawatomi Indian Tribe of Virginia, and the Piscataway Indian Nation. We honor the ancestors as we move toward healing so that all together shall one day know full justice.
Welcome to Accotink Unitarian Universalist Church. I am Christina Watts, and my pronouns are she and her, and I am happy to be your worship associate today. This congregation is a welcoming and inclusive spiritual home where we inspire each other to live our values. Together, we care in community, grow in spirit, and act for justice. If you aren't new to Accotink, look around. Do you see people who you haven't met or haven't spoken to in a while? Help us to live up to our mission to be a welcoming and inclusive spiritual home for all by reaching out and making a connection. By visiting this congregation, newcomers are in a transition moment, and people in transitions are more open to new friendships. Whether you're a longtime member or a newcomer or something in between, we encourage you to stay for our social hour, online or in person, immediately after the service. We're so delighted that you have come to join us today. Welcome.
So this month we're exploring vulnerability. In our first Sunday, we looked at the importance of opening up and being vulnerable, taking that risk, and sharing that emotional vulnerability with those of us in our lives, especially with our children, so that we can model what it means to be open and vulnerable and moving through the challenges of life. But we can't do it alone, so last week we looked at friendship and all the ways that friendship supports us. We looked at the idea that one good way to make friends is to assume that people like you. They actually do. Studies show that there's a gap between what you perceive and how much you perceive other people like you and how much people actually do. Also, there's a gap, a vulnerability gap, that we think that people will see us as weak if we share vulnerable things, but actually they see us as honest, engaging, and authentic when we're vulnerable. So this week, we're going to look at blues music and the idea that we can learn from oppressed people something about how to be vulnerable, to open to the fullness of life, and to really live fully and completely and resiliently together as a community, as a blues people.
Today's reading is adapted from Cornel West's 2015 Ware Lecture. We're going to have to choose to be a blues people. We need to learn from the blues people in our midst, because terrorism and trauma and stigma are not so new to some of us. Catastrophe is not new. Catastrophes have been visited on Black people. Catastrophes have been visited on women. Catastrophes visited on Indigenous people. Catastrophes visited on gay and lesbian people. Catastrophes visited on disabled people. To respond with integrity, honesty, decency, and virtue in the face of catastrophe, that's the blues perspective. To be willing to go down swinging like Ella Fitzgerald and Muhammad Ali, that's the blues perspective. Terrorism and trauma and stigma are not new to some of us. The struggle goes on. You need to learn from the blues people in your midst, to choose to become blues people.
I don't know if you all know about the Ware Lecture. That's a lecture given every year at our Unitarian Universalist General Assembly. I invite you all to consider going to that. Raise your hand if you're going to General Assembly this year. It's in Pittsburgh. Look, we've got quite a few people going. You can also attend online, and you can still register for that. I don't remember who this year's Ware Lecturer is, but it's always an amazing luminary. And in 2015, it was Cornel West. Now, when Cornel West advises us to become blues people, he isn't really talking about the blues, or at least he isn't only talking about the blues. What he is doing is advising us to learn from oppressed and marginalized peoples, communities of people who have had to live through adversity, through trauma, through tragedy, through catastrophe, and not only survive, but thrive in the face of catastrophe. When a person is in, or a group of people is in a privileged position, whether that privilege comes from white privilege or male privilege or economic privilege or educational privilege, there's the possibility that that privilege can give the illusion that catastrophe, that suffering, that pain can be avoided, can be thwarted, outsmarted, outgunned, outlawed, or outrun. Job has this experience in the Bible. Part of his distraughtness is because of the suffering that's been visited upon his family and his life, but part of it is that he thinks his faithfulness should earn him and would have earned him a get-out-of-jail-free card, that his faithfulness would save him from the experience of suffering. Now, there was a time when I thought the story of Job in the Bible was just a myth, just a story. But after working as a chaplain in a level 1 trauma hospital, I know that the story is real, that kind of Jobian suffering is happening to real people every day. Catastrophic tragedies cascading on top of each other. And sooner or later, we all learn that this is the way life works. Trouble is going to come. Suffering is going to come. Trauma and tragedy are going to come. Catastrophe is going to come. Each and every person here today has experienced trauma and tragedy in their life or will experience it. We all have suffering. So we all need to become a blues people, to learn that though trouble waits at every turn, we know we can go on. Notice that I changed the I in the song to we. We know we can go on. Notice that Cornel West isn't advising us to become a blues person. He's inviting us to become blues people, to become a blues people. More on that later in the sermon. The blues, Cornel West tells us, narrates a catastrophe, but doesn't let catastrophe have the last word. Love train still flowing, he says. Empathy train still flowing. Justice train still flowing. A blues sensibility, he tells us, isn't afraid of despair. Despair is not a bad thing, West tells us. He or she or they who has never despaired has never lived. Anyone who looks at the history of the world and doesn't have some element of despair, something's wrong with you, he says. Despair means you have a sensitivity. You just don't let despair have the last word. Instead, you join the caravan of blues people, where catastrophe is always confronting you every minute of your life, institutional catastrophe and personal catastrophe. And then you take that catastrophe and you reshape it with your compassion, with your creativity, into a style and a smile, like B.B. King and Ma Rainey and Bessie Smith, Billie Holiday and Coltrane and Kendrick Lamar. Despair must be heard, but blues people wrestle with catastrophe without allowing despair to have the last word. Despair must be heard, but it doesn't have to have the last word. I want to repeat that Cornel West is not only talking about the blues, that we can learn to be a blues people without knowing anything about the blues. West's point is that we make a choice to learn from the cultural wisdom that is born from historical oppression and marginalization. So that includes the cultural history of survival of black people, of women, of LGBTQ plus people, of disabled people, and the list could go on and on. However, I do want this morning to look at blues music for some features that may be helpful for us in becoming a blues people, in becoming a people who wrestle with catastrophe without allowing despair to have the last word. And the first thing I want to lift up is that blues music embraces the full human experience. It can be joyful, even ecstatic, but also mournful, also angry, also humorous and playful. The blues is for the back porch. Blues music is for the speakeasy and the protest march. It's for the backyard barbecue and for the concert hall. In her book, Blues, Legacies, and Black Feminism, Angela Davis writes, "The blues realm is all-encompassing. In contrast to the condemnatory and censuring character of Christianity, blues knows few taboos. As a cultural form that has long been a target of racist-inspired marginalization, the blues categorically refrains from relegating to the margins any person or behavior. The openness of the blues realm, its repudiation of taboos of all sorts, is rendered possible by the virtue of the fact that the blues always declines to pass judgment. With its non-judgmental character, the blues permits ideas that would be rejected by the larger society into the blues discourse. At its most basic level, this encourages a blues people to open to the full range of the human experience. The good, the bad, the ugly, the trifling, the cheap, the deep, the destructive, the despairing, the deviant. That last example has a special importance. They're all important, but that last example has a special importance because deviance is context specific. At different periods in history and in different communities, all manner of things have been deemed deviant. From same-sex love to gender bending to the empowerment of marginalized people. One of Angela Davis's primary points in the book, Blues, Legacies, and Black Feminism, is that through the blues, black women were able to gain a level of freedom and empowerment not available to them in other spaces, whether those were segregated white spaces or what was, previous to the blues, the only autonomous space for black people, the church. A place where black women were too often relegated to the pews rather than allowed to speak from the pulpit of the male-dominated patriarchal church. So the blues created a space for empowerment. And by opening to the full human experience, a blues people practices moving through difficult emotions and exploring uncharted, even taboo territories. And in so doing, a blues people practices taking catastrophe and reshaping it with compassion and creativity into something life-affirming, transformative, and empowering. This brings us to another aspect of the blues. We explored this together earlier. Whether it's a walking bass line or the repetitive refrain of a rhythm guitar or a chanted mantra, like in John Coltrane's jazz blues opus, A Love Supreme, there is a musical foundation in blues music that brings rest, renewal, and comfort amidst the diverse and often harrowing emotional terrain of life. Speaking about the musical precursors to the blues, the spirituals, theologian James Cone writes that the note of despair in the spirituals was intertwined with confidence and joy that trouble don't last always. Because the faithful can experience the reality of the divine presence, he continues, they can endure suffering and transform it into an event of redemption. Now, it may seem to be straying from my point to emphasize trust in the presence of the divine in a musical form that I just said gave black blues women freedom from the patriarchal confines of the church. But much of the musical inheritance of the spirituals remains alive in the blues, and I would contend that the divine, as the liberating and loving power at the center of life, is expressed in the blues most often through that musical refrain that acts like a riverbed for the rollicking and roiling river of life's trials and tribulations, joys and triumphs. Because a blues people roots their experience in this dependable foundation, in the rhythmic riverbed mantra, a blues people is better able to fully immerse themselves in the ebb and flow of the ultimately fleeting nature of both joy and sorrow, pleasure and pain. And that brings us to the final learning from blues music that we can apply to becoming a blues people. To become a people who wrestles with catastrophe without allowing despair to have the last word. And that's the fact that blues music is a communal music. A communal music that at the same time makes space for individual virtuosity. Blues music provides a musical foundation that is rich in expression while accessible to many skill levels, with a 3-chord progression of the 4-bar blues with its repetition of lyrical lines as an entryway. Beginners can hone their chops, and soloists take turns virtuosically expressing that full range of human experience I spoke of earlier, over top of the refrain, over top of the mantra, over top of the love supreme. The vocalist can whoop in joy, the electric guitar scream in anguish, the drummer hi-hat their delight. Here, in the form of blues music, we see a model for community that acts as a cradle of care for each human being. A communal foundation for each person to express their unique gifts and to tell or sing their personal stories, all while being held in the musical arms of the collective. Cornel West has called us all to become a blues people. By this, he means that we choose to accept that suffering is a part of life, that none of us are immune to trauma or tragedy or catastrophe, that while trouble don't last always, it comes to all of us, sooner or later, without fail and without exception. We can choose to use our compassion and our creativity to shape that suffering into something life-affirming, transformative, and ultimately empowering. We can learn from all those communities of people who have had and continue to have catastrophe visited upon them. We can learn from all the communities, too many to name, who have been submerged in suffering, soaked in the blues. Submersion in suffering can be a baptism of sorts, a rebirth into a new and fuller experience of life. Not an experience of life that transcends suffering, but one that transforms it. So today I lifted up one example of how to learn to become a blues people through the lens of blues music. It's kind of the most obvious example. Blues music as a sensibility, as a metaphor, as a way of life, counsels us to do four things. One, to open ourselves to the fullness of life's experiences, especially emotionally, embracing the sinking feeling of sorrow and the soaring feeling of ecstatic joy, the outrage at injustice and the comfort of a loving embrace, to opening ourselves to even those taboos that our society tells us are deviant, when those taboos reveal themselves to be oppression in disguise. Two, to place love at the center, like a mantra, like a walking bass line, like a repetitive rhythmic guitar riff, a love holding us, a love holding all that we love, so that while we experience the changing courses in life's riverboat journey, we can rest in this love. And finally, 3 and 4, don't go it alone. Create communal forms that are accessible to all while making space for each to express their virtuosity, their personal brand of virtue, their swagger, their style, their quirk, all while being lovingly held in the embrace of the community. The blues narrative narrates a catastrophe, but doesn't let catastrophe have the last word. Instead, we learn to take that catastrophe, that suffering, and to reshape it with our compassion and our creativity. Love train still flowing. Empathy train still flowing. Justice train still flowing. May it be so. May we together become a blues people. Amen, 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 and bluesed be. Blues people be.
As we extinguish our chalice, I invite you can join hands, or if you're not comfortable with that, just extend them towards each other. And I invite you to join me now in our community blessing with these words of David Bumbaugh. This church is dedicated to the proposition that behind all our differences and beneath all our diversity, there is a unity that makes us one and binds us forever together in spite of time and death and the space between the stars. We pause now in silent witness to that unity.